Good afternoon. Good morning. Good afternoon. Good morning. Good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is, yes, still wrapped in a pandemic. I've been saying that for 2 and 3/4 years. Uh, it's mostly tamed down, but it's out there, and the virus still has plenty of running room to uh, evolve in new forms that will pop up again. We're on a human heated planet, which is a forcing that's playing out a lot this summer in many different ways. Extreme heat, extreme downpours. Both of those factors still pretty well linked to human forced global warming. We're on a planet with a disrupted energy system and economy, significantly uh, due to Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine and how that's playing out, including for food security or insecurity. And then you have compound risk, like in the Horn of Africa, which I just wrote a piece about, where you have all of these things coming together: food insecurity, La Nina and/or climate change, forced extreme drought, protracted drought. And today is a very special day in the history of folks who think about hurricanes. Hurricane Andrew was barreling toward Miami, and that part of Florida. I think it struck landfall was, I think, on the 24th, but there's a lot of chatter today out on the internets about hurricanes. And it's also, strangely, the first chunk of this season has been anomalously quiet. And for all these reasons, I reached out to Brian McNoldy at the University of Miami, who's one of my and many people's go-to people on hurricane climatology and behavior and forecasting, especially in the Atlantic Basin. Of course, you're in Miami, which it means there's every reason to pay attention to these issues. So, Brian, thanks for being here on this is Sustain What? I'm Andy Revkin, Columbia Climate School, 37 years on the climate beat. And we're doing this as kind of a pop-up session. So thank you for coming on. I noticed you're tweeting and the hashtag Andrew30. So what are you thinking about today?
Well, first I wanted to say thank you for this opportunity. We've certainly known each other for a long time, and it's great to be back to be talking about hurricanes of all things. Yeah, it is kind of an odd day. I was not living here in 1992 when it happened, but I remember it. I remember watching it on TV, and obviously that's very, very much not the same as being here. But when you are here, it's part of what so many people went through that it's impossible for it to not be like front and center, because it really left such a huge mark in a lot of people's lives who lived in the south part of Florida in 1992.
Yeah, this is a NOAA. This is a NOAA
Yeah.
photos, including this remarkable one. Meteorologists were not immune from this disaster. This was Goldenberg, I think, or at the National Hurricane Center.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing that comes to mind is it has been a very quiet season up to now, and is quiet still. So 1992 also had a pretty quiet start. So it's just one of those things that I think all of us who are kind of looking at this 30 years later are just extremely happy that it's not the current scene, of course.
But it's important, I think, as you say, to remember that we in the media, we pay a lot of attention to the hurricane, the annual sort of beginning of the season. Here's what we think it's going to be, and we pay attention when there's a lot of storms, and we kind of ignore when it's quiet. It's not a story. Things that don't happen aren't stories, but all it takes is one, right?
Yeah, that's a phrase that 1992 pretty much put right in the front of people. That it was a quiet season. Not only did it have a fairly late start, but it didn't end with much either. It was a very quiet season. It just happened to include a Category 5 hurricane that hit South Florida.
And one of the things I've been asking meteorology Twitter about today is when you think about these dynamics, how much more do we know now than 30 years ago about what creates a busy season and what creates these gaps and the like? Is it? I asked if this gap that we've seen so far in this season uh, could be really just deep variability without some particular. Oh, it's La Nina. Oh, it's this. Oh, it's that.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. There's certainly a large scale sort of thing, I guess, because I don't know what it is exactly yet, but that's keeping storms from forming because we are in a La Nina, and typically that acts to enhance Atlantic tropical cyclonic activity, but it's one of many ingredients. So just because that is on that side of its phase, there's other things working against it, and I think one of the things that's out there and has been out there the past month has been quite a lot of dry mid-level air, and so it's really hard for any waves that move off of Africa to form or do much of anything.
Yeah.
So it's just been really quiet.
And is there any way to look at the other dynamics around the world right now? These sustained heat waves, well, now in China, in Europe, particularly part of the United States or North America, and what's happening over the Atlantic, or is it just too iffy?
It's interesting you bring that up because it's not completely crazy to imagine that if you have a kind of an exaggerated high pressure system over the European countries, that this circulation around that high pressure could act to increase the flow off of northern Africa and out over the Atlantic. So that it might be, I'm not saying it is because I don't know that yet, but you can at least imagine it in your head that high pressure over Europe would help to enhance the flow over northern Africa and push even more Saharan air over the Atlantic than we might normally see.
Yeah. What I'm going to show a slide, an image that kind of gives me a lot of respect for scientists like you, because it shows the tangle cumulatively over time. This is again from one of the NOAA divisions, tropical cyclone tracks. The Atlantic data is from 1851 onward because the Atlantic was well studied. That is such a tangle, right?
Yeah.
So, but yet there are patterns. Obviously, you see that recurving. You see those the different colors or different storm intensities. I guess I'll circle back to that question about drivers of these kinds of dynamics on the seasonal scale. What gives what leads to those conclusions at the beginning of the year, and then halfway through there's kind of a revision. Amid all of that, for people who might say, "Well, God, this is just such a mess." How do we know what we know?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this kind of long range outlook sort of thing. When you see these forecasts for the whole hurricane season, there's quite a few places that create them now, but it was really CSU and Bill Gray that really was the kind of the grandfather of hurricane, I guess, like a seasonal forecasting. Mm-hmm. And if I'm not mistaken, the first one was 1984, and it's been going on every year since then. He has since passed away, but Phil Klotzbach, who was one of his students, has carried the torch. And so we still have those seasonal forecasts going from them. So a part of that, it involves understanding large scale things, that are going on around the world. So not just looking at current storms in the Atlantic, but let's say in May, what can that infer about the next few months? So you're not just looking at the Atlantic. A lot of things that they look at are scattered around the world. Of what is this surface pressure doing here? What are these winds doing over here? And they all link. It's all all one Earth, all one atmosphere. So
Right. We just call them different things in different places too.
yeah.
And yeah, and I think at the global scale, the sort of the average number of storms that reach hurricane strength doesn't really change much, right? Or is there some shift over time?
I don't, without looking it up right now, I don't think there's been a huge trend in that yet, at least.
Yeah, and there were some studies, actually, just in recent months, there was another study showing that overall, the number of hurricanes is expected to decline in a human heated world. Their intensity and, of course, their rainfall intensity and those other secondary features are expected to be juiced up. That's a kind of a challenging message to give to a coastal mayor.
Yeah, yeah, and that's again, it's kind of a long-term expectation. You know, you're going to have seasons and such that don't cooperate with that, but that seems to be an overall. I think most people agree on that who are in the field, that we may see fewer named storms, but of the ones that form, they could be more intense. Yeah.
And I couldn't help pulling up this story I did in 2001, way back in July. Actually, Goldenberg, who was in that picture,
Hmm.
and Chris Lancy, a colleague, were lead authors on a science paper that got on the front page of the New York Times then. U.S. and Caribbean face era of more and big hurricanes. The dynamics then, many scientists were pointing to ocean circulation as a driver of some of these longer timescale dynamics. And then climate change definitely got into the mix around the time of Katrina, which was 4 or 5 years after this. There was that big flurry of debate, and now we seem to be back to actually, Michael Mann and others have done work questioning whether there is an oscillation in the ocean on those timescales. But they're clearly, and I guess this gets back to what the public should think and do. When you think about hurricanes, this is very seductive for me as a reporter, right? And it's seductive for you as a scientist. And this generated all these really good, good back and forth science and good back and forth discourse. But circling back to what people need to know, I think it still comes back to some pretty basic things.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, I think the main thing it comes back to is the phrase you mentioned right at the start, was it only takes one.
Yeah.
Don't worry about what the seasonal forecast is, or don't worry about if we're in some long-term oscillation and that sort of thing. Like, if there's a hurricane out there and you're in its future, that's what you need to be worried about.
Yeah. And this gets back to your, let's talk about communication. You use Twitter a lot, and you were writing a blog. I think, well, you still do. I get your
Yeah,
news, whether you call it a newsletter or a blog. I
a
still,
blog from that's been around a few years now.
yeah, I still think of it as blogging, even though I write what's technically a newsletter now. And
Yeah,
I'd like to talk to you about that a little bit. Just like, you don't
sure.
have to be communicating this science. You could be teaching. You're at University of Miami. You could be doing other things with your time. What draws you to the public sphere?
That's interesting. So I started the blog before the term blog was invented, but it was 1996, and it's certainly grown, and it's a lot more fun now. It didn't used to have all the movies and pictures and all that you can put in now. But back in the mid-90s, it was text.
Right.
So, but it started, I guess, because I had people that I knew who were interested in it, and I for sure was very interested in it. But I wanted to provide something that was a one-stop shop, that that they could just read and not have to go hunting for information scattered all around. I guess another thing to remember is, in the mid-90s, that while there were websites, there were far fewer than there are now.
Right.
There were far fewer tools out there that you could look information up, and and all that stuff. So I did that work and then just wrote a text kind of if there was something going on in the Atlantic and with hurricanes, tropical storms, whatever, I would write something about it, and that was that. And it was meant to be understood by the average person because that's the people who I knew who wanted to know about it.
Right.
So right from the start, it was always meant to just be kind of a broad brush kind of thing.
And graphics like this are really, you've gotten very good. You're among, there are people who do this with sea ice in the Arctic. There's a young scientist, Zach Labe, who was at UC Irvine, who's a great visualizer. You're tracking the data on storm energy here in a way that really tells the story. That's that little yellow there is this year's cumulative energy expended by, is it tropical cyclones?
Yeah.
Above a certain threshold?
Yeah, anything that's a tropical storm or above. So
Yeah.
tropical storms and hurricanes, yeah.
And the average there, it just shows you again what makes this so weird.
It's very, very unusual to just have been flatlined since it's been about when I guess July 3rd, I think was maybe the last named storm. I forget exactly the date, but it was a very short-lived blip. And so it's what you're seeing here is what over the past 50 years, the blue curve just shows where you would normally be with this ACE, this accumulated cyclone energy.
Right.
And when you're back in the first couple months of the season, the values are low to begin with. So if you're at 12 or 13% of a low number, it's not really a big deal. You can make that up in a flash.
Right.
But this week we're going to be at that 12 or 13% of average, but in late August.
Right.
That starts to become a pretty big number that we're behind by. And it's not like there's any reason we have to be average.
Right.
There's no harm in that, of course, but it's just kind of an oddity in a season that, for lots of reasons, a lot of the groups that make those long-term forecasts, I think across the board, everyone's expecting this to be an above average season. And It still could be, we still can't count this out, but it's off to a very slow start.
Yeah, well, I'll get back there. Of course, as you could see, September 1, historically, or at least through these, as you said, the last half century, it all piles up in the months we're coming into. Those who in the New York area who remember Sandy, that was in here. Storms, I think of, there's lots of late season hurricanes or tropical storms that can be devastating.
Yeah.
So this gets back to if you live, well, one of the messages I think hopefully people are starting to get, and maybe you could talk about this a little bit, is I think hurricanes historically have been seen as a coastal threat. That's just people on Long Island, or in the outer reaches of the Carolinas who have to worry. But that hasn't been the case. Ida was a classic example of a storm that was devastating through these really ancillary extreme downpours.
Yeah,
it became a devastating and deadly event. There was a storm I wrote about when I was doing one of my paleo tempestology articles about all this evidence in beach layers of past hurricane patterns. There was a storm that had struck in Vermont in November 1927. It was an eroding hurricane, created the worst flood event in the history of Vermont. So that seems to be, the fact that this is not just a coastal thing seems to be percolating.
Yeah, and it's always been the case, but I feel like in the last five-ish years that it's really come out more that rain is nothing you want to just ignore or forget about with a hurricane. Rain is an extremely powerful thing. It in terms of the number of people killed, number how expensive it is when an area floods. But I would say more often than not, people don't even think about rain when they think about a hurricane. They think about wind.
Right. It gets the well, that's what gets the meteorologists out there in their slickers tied to trees.
Yeah.
It's the drama. But the drama was pretty extreme with the extreme flooding we saw. And there was just, I think in Dallas, it was just a 3 inch an hour
Yeah.
event, which was pretty much what the New York area got from Ida. These are extraordinary. Who do you pay attention to? Who do you follow? I have a Twitter list myself. I call it Weather Wizards. I shouldn't use the word wizard because it implies something less than science, but it's a group of people I've not all of whom I follow regularly, but Jack Sillen, Scott Duncan over in England. And I don't know if you have your own go-to list that you rely on as well.
I don't have an actual list per se, but it is kind of a mental list, and I go through them, and on the spot, I don't want to mention some because I know I'm going to leave some important ones out. But I would say there's probably 5 to 10 or so people who I think are always on top of the game, and always have some good ways to look at history or insights or forecasts or that kind of thing. So without going into names, because I don't want to.
Sure, that's fine.
I know I'm forget, but yes, there are certainly people that whatever they come up with, I respect because I know and am assured that they know what they're talking about.
I'll mention a couple. You, of course, John Morales was also there in your area, and Jeff Berardelli, who moved down to Florida, have been great. The folks at Climate Central do really good work, and Capital Weather Gang. I think Capital Weather Gang. I'll say something here, frankly. Years and years and years ago, when I was still at the New York Times, I was saying, I think I might have pointed to you and said, we should have a weather blog here at the Times, because when Sandy hit, I was posting 2 or 3 times a day, but I'm not just a weather person, and they never kind of really, it never gelled there. The Times is doing great work, but Capital Weather Gang, Jason Semenow and his crew seem to have really done something special, way beyond the Washington D.C. Beltway area. I don't know if that feels.
I agree. They're pretty much, they're on top of things too, really well. It's been a good crew there, and your memory does serve you right. And that, the Times did have a hurricane blog, and I wrote for that. That was, I think, 2007 to 10 or thereabouts. I don't remember the years exactly, but it was that time frame. And you're right. I remember doing that.
Well, smarter people than me at the New York Times decided to go in different directions. So who am I to say I was right? But I do think there's a role for the media here still, to normalize reaching out to experts like you and having that be part of what's presented on a website when people are tuning in. So it isn't always through the filter of a newsroom, which has issues. There's Jeff Masters. He's another one, of course. I think we all deeply respect, and Bob Henson. Who, something about the newsroom dynamic demands that there's almost like a curatorial. There's an ownership quality. It has to go through an editor's eyeballs before it gets presented. But as I was saying earlier, then no one's writing about the quiet times, the seasons where it's not an extraordinary season. The news process gets in the way sometimes of presenting information that people need.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's interesting. That when you're free to just explore why is it quiet, it's not the most fun story for like a news outlet to cover, but it's important still. You want to know why things are active or why they're quiet.
Right. And you want to know the full source of vulnerability too. Often it's not the storm so much as the vulnerability in a community. I did see this just now, which is interesting,
Hmm.
from Molly McCollum. The MDR is
Main development region.
right off of West Africa, right?
Yeah, yeah. So it's kind of the deep tropics, basically between the Caribbean and the west coast of Africa.
Right. And I did see a couple little yellow scribbles on the one of the National Hurricane Center
Yeah,
charts.
the models are starting to get a little more engaged with these waves. The first one on the left there, on the west, not so much, but the next one or two, the models are starting to get a little interested in. So I don't think this quiet period is going to last a whole lot longer.
Yeah, well, and getting back to your graphic of the historical averages of the energy dissipation, it's pretty clear that the months September onward is when we have to really gear up.
Yeah, yeah.
But maybe we'll just close with a few more minutes on the hashtag Andrew30 is there for this hurricane. It did result in some changes to building codes. The storm
Yeah.
ripped apart so many houses, it exposed the weaknesses and flaws and corruption,
Yeah.
and changed many things. Has there been other things that have changed because, right after that?
Well, unfortunately for those of us who live here now, it definitely changed the insurance market.
Right.
It's quite expensive to insure property here. Not only do you have your normal homeowners insurance, but windstorm policies, which is the hurricane only part, that your homeowners does not include. That's the expensive part. And
Right.
you don't have a lot of options when it comes to insurance companies, because in 1992, that made a lot of insurers go broke, and so some of them don't even want to have that amount of exposure now, and they're not even in the
Right.
market.
Right. Well, in a way, that's the ultimate climate adaptation forcing mechanism.
Yep.
People will increasingly need to move. The sad thing there is, again, as I said earlier about vulnerability, if you have money, if you're at the high end of the economy, all this is sort of like something you can brush off. If you're
Yeah.
in the poor part of Miami, away from the coast, you're stuck with these issues, and you almost assuredly don't have insurance. Even renters insurance. I don't imagine there's renters hurricane insurance. I'm just guessing, but
I don't know.
yeah, but so that's this unbalanced
Yeah.
reality on the impact side. Well, Brian, it's been great to have you here today. I know you're busy, and here's one more tweet. Beginning at sunrise on August 23rd, 1992, Category 5 Andrew was on its way to the northern Bahamas, reached peak intensity just before reaching the Bahamas. Peak sustained winds of 175 miles per hour.
Yeah, and that peak is, just by total coincidence, right about now, this time of day.
Wow. It's a very sobering reality to remember. And I hope everybody listening, please share this when we're done. Share it with the hashtag Andrew30 if you want, but with the message that preparedness is key, whether it's a quiet year or a tempestuous one, like we've had many in recent years. If you're in harm's way, know your vulnerabilities. Know your vulnerabilities if you're inland. Know who else is vulnerable around you. Someone renting a basement apartment is more vulnerable than you are to flash flooding. And that kind of awareness, I think, can build forward toward a more resilient society. And it's great to have the science helping to clarify and narrow the picture of what we face from these hazards are all around us. So thanks, Brian McNoldy, for being on a pop-up, opportunistic, sustain what conversation through the Columbia Climate School. This
My
is
pleasure.
Andy Revkin coming to you from Penobscot territory in coastal Maine area, now called Lemoyne. And please stay tuned for more always. You can look at the little scrolling bar at the bottom to figure out how to get in touch with me. And Brian, good luck with the rest of the season with all the great work you do.
All right. Thank you, Andy. Take care.
Take care.